Most people think Tom Cruise wins interviews because he's one of the biggest movie stars in the world. That's only part of the story. His real advantage isn't fame, power, or status, it's composure. While some celebrities get defensive, lose their patience, or try to dodge uncomfortable questions, Tom has built a reputation for doing something far more impressive. He stays calm, listens carefully, and then responds so precisely that the person asking the question often ends up looking unprepared. For decades, interviewers have tried everything to catch him off guard. They've pushed into his private life, challenged his beliefs, compared him to other actors, thrown politically loaded questions his way, and even crossed the line with outright disrespect. Time after time, they expected an emotional reaction. Time after time, they walked away with something completely different. Because Tom Cruise doesn't need to raise his voice to take control of a conversation. He doesn't rely on insults. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't lose his cool. Instead, he lets confidence, discipline, and carefully chosen words do all the work. And when that happens, the entire interview changes. The spotlight shifts away from him and lands squarely on the person asking the question. That's exactly what makes these moments so unforgettable. They aren't about shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. They're about the rare ability to stay composed when everyone else expects you to crack. It's a skill that has earned Tom Cruise respect from millions of fans and made interviewers think twice before trying to corner him. Today, we're counting down 10 unforgettable moments that prove one simple lesson. If you try to put Tom Cruise on the spot, you'd better come prepared. Because when you cross the line, he won't argue. He won't panic. He'll simply outclass you. For more than 4 decades, Tom Cruise has remained one of Hollywood's most recognizable and talked about stars. From blockbuster action films to award-winning performances, he's built a career that few actors have ever matched. But with that level of fame comes something else: constant public scrutiny. Every press tour, every red carpet, and every television appearance becomes an opportunity for someone to ask the question everyone else is afraid to ask. Some interviewers genuinely want a thoughtful conversation. Others are chasing a viral headline. They push for controversial opinions, dig into deeply personal subjects, or frame questions in a way that's designed to make even the most experienced celebrity lose their composure. It's a strategy that's worked on plenty of famous faces over the years. Tom Cruise, however, has developed a very different reputation. Instead of reacting emotionally, he listens. Instead of rushing to defend himself, he carefully chooses his words. And instead of letting the interviewer control the direction of the conversation, he quietly takes it back. Sometimes he does it with a single question, sometimes with a calm correction, and sometimes all it takes is a few seconds of silence for the entire room to realize who is actually in control. That doesn't mean every exchange is comfortable. In fact, some of these interviews became incredibly tense. There were awkward pauses, loaded questions, personal topics, and moments that could have easily turned into public arguments. Yet, despite the pressure, Tom rarely abandoned the calm, disciplined approach that has become one of his defining traits. Whether you agree with every opinion he's shared or not, one thing is difficult to ignore. When an interview starts going off the rails, Tom Cruise has an uncanny ability to stay composed while everyone around him grows increasingly uncomfortable. That self-control is exactly why so many of these encounters are still discussed years later. So let's count down 10 unforgettable moments when interviewers thought they had Tom Cruise backed into a corner, only to discover that keeping your cool can be the strongest response of all. Our countdown begins with one of the most controversial interviews of Tom Cruise's career, an exchange that generated headlines around the world and is still talked about years later. It wasn't a discussion about an upcoming movie or an action scene. Instead, it quickly turned into a debate over mental health, prescription medication, and Tom's outspoken views on psychiatry. The interviewer raised questions about comments Tom had previously made regarding antidepressants, bringing up actress Brooke Shields and her public experience with postpartum depression. It was the kind of topic that could easily become emotional, and many expected the conversation to spiral into a heated argument. But Tom never raised his voice. From the moment the subject came up, he answered with complete confidence. Rather than backing away from the controversy, he explained his position point by point, insisting that medication was treating symptoms rather than addressing what he believed to be the root of the problem. Every time the interviewer tried to simplify the issue or steer him toward a yes or no answer, Tom calmly redirected the conversation back to the points he wanted to make. The interviewer continued pressing him, hoping to pin him down with follow-up questions. Instead of becoming frustrated, Tom challenged the assumptions behind those questions. His responses were measured, deliberate, and remarkably consistent. Even as the discussion grew more uncomfortable, his tone barely changed. What made this moment so memorable wasn't simply the disagreement itself. It was the contrast between the two men. One side kept pushing for a dramatic reaction, while the other refused to provide one. Tom stayed composed from beginning to end, never allowing the conversation to turn into a shouting match. Whether viewers agreed with his opinions or strongly disagreed, many noticed the same thing. He remained in control of his emotions. He wasn't trying to win through volume or intimidation. He relied on conviction, patience, and the confidence to defend his perspective under intense public scrutiny. That exchange quickly became one of the most discussed celebrity interviews of its time. It divided audiences, sparked endless debate, and demonstrated just how difficult it was to rattle Tom Cruise, even when the questions became deeply personal and highly controversial. And as intense as that conversation was, it wouldn't be the last time an interviewer underestimated just how firmly Tom was willing to stand his ground. Being a global superstar often means living under a microscope. Fans are naturally curious about relationships, marriages, and family life, and interviewers know those topics can generate attention almost instantly. But Tom Cruise has always believed there's a difference between genuine curiosity and crossing a personal boundary. That difference became crystal clear during an interview when the conversation shifted toward his marriage to Nicole Kidman. At first, the question seemed harmless enough. The interviewer asked whether Nicole had been the love of his life, inviting Tom to reflect on one of the most talked-about relationships in Hollywood. Rather than avoiding the subject, Tom acknowledged the years they had spent together and the family they had built. His answers were respectful, thoughtful, and free of bitterness. But the interview didn't stop there. The questions became increasingly personal. Instead of focusing on Tom's career or his current projects, the conversation kept returning to his former marriage. The interviewer continued probing, asking about his feelings, his private conversations, and details that had little to do with the reason he was there. For many celebrities, that kind of persistence can be frustrating. Some become defensive. Others try to laugh it off or abruptly end the interview. Tom chose a different approach. Without changing his tone or showing visible anger, he calmly pointed out that the conversation had crossed a line. There was no dramatic outburst, no harsh insult, and no attempt to embarrass the interviewer. Just a simple, direct reminder that some questions don't deserve an answer simply because they're being asked. What happened next made the exchange unforgettable. When the interviewer suggested that the audience wanted to know these answers, Tom quietly challenged that assumption. He made it clear that the curiosity wasn't coming from millions of viewers. It was coming from the person sitting across from him. With one calm observation, he shifted the pressure away from himself and back onto the interviewer. It was a subtle move, but an incredibly effective one. Instead of defending his privacy, Tom made the interviewer defend the question itself. The atmosphere changed almost instantly. The confidence that had driven the personal questioning began to fade, replaced by an awkward realization that the conversation had gone further than it should have. That moment became a perfect example of why Tom Cruise is so difficult to corner. He doesn't avoid uncomfortable conversations, but he also refuses to let anyone dictate the limits of his personal life. He understands that being famous doesn't mean giving up every piece of privacy, and he's never been afraid to say so with calm confidence. As memorable as that exchange was, the next interviewer would discover that trying to lure Tom into a political controversy wasn't any easier. Few things can derail a celebrity interview faster than a politically charged question. One unexpected comment can dominate headlines, overshadow an entire film, and spark days of controversy online. That's exactly why some interviewers choose to steer conversations in that direction, hoping for a response that becomes bigger than the project being promoted. During one international press event, Tom Cruise found himself facing exactly that kind of situation. The discussion had been centered on his latest film and the incredible locations where it had been shot. Everything seemed routine, until the interviewer suddenly shifted gears. Instead of asking about the movie itself, they brought up international trade policies and tariffs affecting overseas film productions. It was an unexpected turn that had very little to do with Tom's performance or the story audiences had come to hear about. The question sounded reasonable on the surface, but it placed Tom in a difficult position. Any detailed answer could easily become a political headline, while refusing to answer might be portrayed as avoiding the issue altogether. Many celebrities in that situation try to explain themselves, offering long answers that only create more opportunities for follow-up questions. Tom took a completely different approach. Rather than walking into a debate that had nothing to do with the purpose of the interview, he calmly declined to engage. There was no frustration in his voice, no visible irritation, and no attempt to lecture the interviewer. He simply made it clear that he wasn't going to be pulled into a conversation that shifted the focus away from the film. The exchange lasted only a few moments, but it spoke volumes. Sometimes the strongest response isn't delivering the perfect argument. It's recognizing when a question is leading you somewhere you never intended to go. Tom understood that every answer creates another question, and by refusing to take the bait, he quietly ended the discussion before it could grow into something much larger. What stood out most was how effortless it seemed. There was no dramatic confrontation and no uncomfortable back and forth. The interview simply moved on, leaving the attempted diversion behind. It's a reminder that composure isn't always about having the last word. Sometimes it's about knowing which conversations are worth having and which ones aren't. Tom didn't need to win a political debate that day because he never agreed to enter one in the first place. That quiet restraint frustrated anyone hoping for a viral controversy, but it perfectly reflected the approach Tom has developed over decades in the public eye. Stay focused, stay professional, and never let someone else decide the direction of your conversation. And while that interviewer failed to draw him into a political discussion, the next one tried something completely different, an awkward hypothetical that left Tom wondering why anyone would even ask it. By this point in his career, Tom Cruise had answered thousands of interview questions. He'd been asked about impossible stunts, blockbuster franchises, co-stars, and everything in between. But every now and then, an interviewer throws out a question so strange that it completely changes the tone of the conversation. This was one of those moments. During a press tour, the discussion had been flowing naturally. Tom was talking enthusiastically about filming intense action sequences with one of his fellow actors. He described the physical demands of the fight choreography, the trust required between performers, and the effort that goes into making those scenes feel believable on screen. It was exactly the kind of behind-the-scenes insight fans enjoy hearing. Then, out of nowhere, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Instead of asking about the filming process or the preparation behind the action scenes, the interviewer posed a hypothetical question. If the fight happened for real, who would actually win? It was the kind of question designed to create an entertaining headline. Rather than celebrating the teamwork behind the movie, it encouraged comparison and competition between two friends who had worked closely together. Tom paused for a moment, clearly surprised by where the conversation had gone. But instead of playing along or trying to come up with a clever answer, he calmly questioned the premise itself. Rather than debating who was stronger or tougher, he pointed out something much more important. Why would he spend time imagining a real fight with someone he genuinely respected? With that simple response, the entire focus of the interview shifted. Suddenly, the awkwardness wasn't coming from Tom. It was coming from the question itself. Instead of defending his answer, he encouraged everyone listening to think about why such a scenario needed to be discussed in the first place. It was a subtle but effective way of exposing how easily interviews can drift away from meaningful conversation in pursuit of a catchy soundbite. What made the moment especially memorable was Tom's consistency. He never mocked the interviewer, never became sarcastic, and never acted offended. He simply refused to entertain an idea that didn't reflect reality. His respect for his colleague mattered more than creating a viral moment. That response also revealed something about Tom's mindset. Throughout his career, he's often spoken about collaboration, preparation, and the people who help bring his films to life. Turning a friend into an imaginary opponent for the sake of entertainment was never something he seemed interested in doing. In just a few calm sentences, he redirected the conversation back to what actually mattered. The manufactured conflict disappeared, and in its place was a reminder that professionalism sometimes means refusing to play along with the question everyone expects you to answer. As composed as Tom was in that interview, the next incident wasn't just awkward, it crossed into outright disrespect. And this time, his response would leave an even bigger impression than any clever comeback ever could. Most celebrities expect difficult questions during a press tour. They prepare for criticism, awkward interviews, and uncomfortable conversations. It's all part of living in the public eye. But there's one thing almost no one expects: being physically humiliated in the middle of what is supposed to be a professional interview. That's exactly what happened to Tom Cruise during a red carpet event. Everything began like a normal media appearance. Tom was greeting reporters, smiling for cameras, and taking questions about his latest project. Like always, he was giving each interviewer his full attention, treating every conversation with the same professionalism that has defined his career. Then, without warning, the situation changed. A man posing as a reporter suddenly sprayed water directly into Tom's face using a hidden device disguised as a microphone. The prank was clearly designed to shock him in front of the cameras and capture an explosive reaction. Whoever planned it was likely hoping for shouting, anger, or a dramatic confrontation that would spread across television and the internet. For a split second, everyone around them froze. Many people expected Tom to lash out. Instead, he did something far more powerful. He looked the man straight in the eyes and calmly asked a simple question. Why would you do something like that? There was no screaming, no threats, no attempt to create an even bigger spectacle. His voice remained controlled, but every word carried weight. As the prankster tried to back away, Tom stopped him from simply walking off and made it clear that running away didn't erase what had just happened. He explained that he had been standing there, respectfully answering questions and giving his time, only to be met with deliberate disrespect. His disappointment was impossible to miss. More than anything, he seemed genuinely confused that someone would treat another person that way simply for a cheap laugh. And that's what made the moment unforgettable. Anger often gives the other person exactly what they're looking for. It creates chaos, headlines, and endless replay value. Tom refused to hand over that victory. By staying calm, he forced the attention onto the prank itself rather than his reaction. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. One person had come looking for attention through humiliation. The other responded with dignity and self-control. Without raising his voice, Tom made the prankster appear immature, while he remained composed throughout the encounter. For many viewers, this wasn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. It became a lesson in handling disrespect. Tom demonstrated that standing up for yourself doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes a calm, direct response exposes bad behavior more effectively than any emotional outburst ever could. The incident quickly became one of the most talked-about moments of his public appearances, not because of the prank itself, but because of how effortlessly Tom refused to let someone else dictate his behavior. And if that encounter proved he could stay composed during outright disrespect, the next interview would test something completely different. This time, the challenge came wrapped in an innocent-sounding hypothetical that questioned whether Tom Cruise could ever live an ordinary life. By the halfway point of our countdown, it's clear that not every difficult interview comes wrapped in obvious confrontation. Sometimes the most challenging questions sound friendly, even playful. But beneath the surface, they're designed to force a celebrity into admitting that their life is completely disconnected from everyone else's. One interviewer tried exactly that. The conversation began with a lighthearted reference to The Mission: Impossible films, specifically the famous masks that allow characters to disguise themselves as someone else. It was a clever setup, and at first, it seemed like the discussion was heading toward one of Tom's iconic movie moments. Then came the real question. The interviewer asked Tom to imagine wearing a mask that made him look like an ordinary person, someone no one would recognize. If he could spend an entire day without anyone knowing he was Tom Cruise, what would he do? It sounded harmless enough. But hidden inside the question was a bigger assumption. That Tom's life was so extraordinary that, given the chance, he would desperately want to escape it. Many celebrities might have answered by talking about how much they missed privacy, how difficult fame had become, or all the things they wished they could do unnoticed. Tom surprised everyone. Without hesitation, he explained that he would do exactly what he already does. He'd watch movies. He'd make movies. He'd travel. He'd meet people. In other words, he wouldn't suddenly become someone different just because nobody recognized him. It wasn't a defensive answer. It wasn't an attempt to convince anyone that fame has no challenges. Instead, it reflected something much deeper: gratitude. Tom spoke about how fortunate he felt to be living the life he had dreamed of since he was young. He talked about traveling across the world, working with talented people, and experiencing places he never imagined he'd see. Rather than treating his career like a burden, he described it as a privilege, one he never wanted to take for granted. That response quietly dismantled the entire premise of the question. The interviewer expected Tom to reveal a hidden fantasy about escaping celebrity life. Instead, Tom revealed that he wasn't trying to escape anything. He genuinely enjoyed the work, the travel, and even many of the interactions that came with being one of the world's most recognizable actors. What made the exchange so effective was its sincerity. There was no rehearsed speech, no dramatic declaration, just a calm explanation from someone who seemed completely comfortable with the life he had built. It's a reminder that confidence doesn't always come from proving people wrong. Sometimes it comes from knowing yourself so well that a loaded question simply has nowhere to land. Tom didn't reject the question or criticize the interviewer. He answered honestly, and in doing so, he completely changed the direction of the conversation. Instead of discussing the downsides of fame, he spoke about appreciation, purpose, and the joy he still finds in doing what he loves. That quiet confidence once again denied the interviewer the reaction they may have been expecting. But if they thought Tom's answer was surprising, the next interviewer would discover something even more unexpected. When challenged about whether he could live like an ordinary person, Tom didn't just insist that he could. He shared a story that made the entire audience smile. For most people, becoming one of the biggest movie stars on the planet seems like a dream. But there's a side to that level of fame that few ever experience. Every public appearance attracts attention. Every walk through an airport becomes a photo opportunity. Even something as simple as grabbing a coffee can turn into a crowd gathering within minutes. So it's no surprise that interviewers often wonder whether someone like Tom Cruise can still enjoy ordinary moments. During one late-night interview, that exact topic came up. The host joked about how difficult it must be for Tom to move around in public without being recognized. He wondered if there were ever times when Tom wished he could simply go from one place to another without attracting attention. Could he ride public transportation? Could he casually visit a museum? Or had fame made those everyday experiences impossible? It was a fair question, and many celebrities would have answered by describing the frustrations that come with constant recognition. Tom took a different route. He smiled and explained that he doesn't build his life around avoiding people. Instead of hiding away or constantly changing his routine, he accepts that being recognized is simply part of the career he chose. He doesn't allow it to stop him from doing the things he enjoys. Then he shared a story that instantly made his point more powerful than any simple yes or no answer ever could. Tom explained that he has, on more than one occasion, traveled on public transportation. He recalled putting on a baseball cap, slipping in a pair of headphones, and taking the subway just like everyone else. Sometimes it worked exactly as planned. Other times, someone would recognize him despite his attempt to blend into the crowd. One particular memory stood out. He described sitting quietly during a busy commute while most passengers were focused on their phones. Across from him, a young girl looked up, stared for a moment, and slowly began realizing who was sitting just a few feet away. He noticed the expression on her face as she looked around, almost unable to believe what she was seeing. Rather than turning the moment into a story about being famous, Tom told it with warmth and humor. There was no boasting, no attempt to make himself sound larger than life. If anything, he seemed to enjoy the ordinary human interaction more than the fact that he had been recognized. That small story completely changed the atmosphere of the interview. Instead of debating whether Tom Cruise could live like everyone else, the audience was listening to a genuine experience that felt surprisingly relatable. It wasn't about luxury or celebrity privilege. It was about taking a train, sharing a quiet moment with strangers, and appreciating the unexpected encounters that happen along the way. The interviewer had expected a conversation about the limitations of fame. Tom turned it into a conversation about perspective. He made it clear that he doesn't spend his life running from the public. He understands that recognition comes with the job, but he refuses to let it define every decision he makes. He embraces the reality of his career while continuing to enjoy simple experiences whenever the opportunity presents itself. It's another reason why Tom is so difficult to catch off guard. When someone expects him to complain, he expresses gratitude. When someone assumes he'll describe his life as impossible, he responds with a real story that quietly disproves the assumption. By the end of the exchange, there was nothing left to challenge. Tom hadn't argued with the host or tried to prove a point through clever one-liners. He simply shared an honest experience, and that honesty spoke louder than any debate could have. As impressive as that moment was, the the next interview would become even more personal. This time, the challenge wasn't about fame. It was about whether Tom Cruise was even the right actor for one of the biggest roles of his career. By the halfway point of our countdown, it's clear that not every difficult interview comes wrapped in obvious confrontation. Sometimes the most challenging questions sound friendly, even playful. But beneath the surface, they're designed to force a celebrity into admitting that their life is completely disconnected from everyone else's. One interviewer tried exactly that. The conversation began with a lighthearted reference to the mission, impossible films, specifically the famous masks that allow characters to disguise themselves as someone else. It was a clever setup, and at first, it seemed like the discussion was heading toward one of Tom's iconic movie moments. Then came the real question. The interviewer asked Tom to imagine wearing a mask that made him look like an ordinary person, someone no one would recognize. If he could spend an entire day without anyone knowing he was Tom Cruise, what would he do? It sounded harmless enough. But hidden inside the question was a bigger assumption. That Tom's life was so extraordinary that, given the chance, he would desperately want to escape it. Many celebrities might have answered by talking about how much they missed privacy, how difficult fame had become, or all the things they wished they could do unnoticed. Tom surprised everyone. Without hesitation, he explained that he would do exactly what he already does. He'd watch movies. He'd make movies. He'd travel. He'd meet people. In other words, he wouldn't suddenly become someone different just because nobody recognized him. It wasn't a defensive answer. It wasn't an attempt to convince anyone that fame has no challenges. Instead, it reflected something much deeper: gratitude. Tom spoke about how fortunate he felt to be living the life he had dreamed of since he was young. He talked about traveling across the world, working with talented people, and experiencing places he never imagined he'd see. Rather than treating his career like a burden, he described it as a privilege, one he never wanted to take for granted. That response quietly dismantled the entire premise of the question. The interviewer expected Tom to reveal a hidden fantasy about escaping celebrity life. Instead, Tom revealed that he wasn't trying to escape anything. He genuinely enjoyed the work, the travel, and even many of the interactions that came with being one of the world's most recognizable actors. What made the exchange so effective was its sincerity. There was no rehearsed speech, no dramatic declaration, just a calm explanation from someone who seemed completely comfortable with the life he had built. It's a reminder that confidence doesn't always come from proving people wrong. Sometimes it comes from knowing yourself so well that a loaded question simply has nowhere to land. Tom didn't reject the question or criticize the interviewer. He answered honestly, and in doing so, he completely changed the direction of the conversation. Instead of discussing the downsides of fame, he spoke about appreciation, purpose, and the joy he still finds in doing what he loves. That quiet confidence once again denied the interviewer the reaction they may have been expecting. But if they thought Tom's answer was surprising, the next interviewer would discover something even more unexpected. When challenged about whether he could live like an ordinary person, Tom didn't just insist that he could. He shared a story that made the entire audience smile. By the time this interview reached its final moments, it was obvious that the atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a conversation about films and performances had gradually turned into something much more confrontational. The interviewer seemed determined to push boundaries, framing questions in ways that invited conflict instead of discussion. Tom Cruise had remained composed throughout. He had answered politely, stayed focused on the subject at hand, and refused to let frustration show. But then came another question that crossed the line, not because it was difficult, but because of the way it was framed. Instead of asking directly, the interviewer tried to hide behind a familiar phrase. People are saying, or others think. It was a way of introducing criticism without taking responsibility for it personally. It's a technique that's common in interviews. Rather than owning a challenging question, the interviewer places the words in someone else's mouth, making it harder for the person being interviewed to respond directly. If the answer becomes uncomfortable, the interviewer can always claim they were simply representing public opinion. Tom recognized the tactic immediately. Without raising his voice or showing any sign of irritation, he calmly interrupted the pattern. He explained that if the interviewer wanted to ask something, they should ask it directly. There was no need to hide behind anonymous opinions or vague references to what other people supposedly believed. It was a simple point, but it completely changed the dynamic of the conversation. In just a few sentences, Tom shifted the focus away from himself and onto the interviewer's responsibility. Instead of defending against an invisible crowd, he encouraged the interviewer to own the question and stand behind it. That moment caught the interviewer off guard. The confidence that had driven the conversation suddenly disappeared. The interviewer realized the criticism could no longer be disguised as someone else's opinion. It now belonged to them. Then came the line that made the exchange unforgettable. Tom calmly suggested that the interviewer remember their manners. There was no sarcasm, no shouting, no attempt to embarrass anyone in front of the cameras. It sounded more like advice than an attack, a quiet reminder that respect should exist on both sides of the conversation. The effect was immediate. Rather than arguing or becoming defensive, the interviewer acknowledged that they had gone too far and offered a sincere apology. It wasn't forced. It wasn't reluctant. It was a genuine recognition that the conversation had crossed a professional boundary. Tom accepted the apology just as calmly as he had requested it. No victory lap. No lingering resentment. The interview simply moved forward. That's what makes this moment so remarkable. Tom didn't win because he embarrassed the interviewer. He won because he never allowed the discussion to become personal. He addressed the behavior instead of attacking the individual, leaving room for the conversation to recover. It's an approach that requires enormous self-control. In a world where public disagreements often become louder and more hostile by the minute, Tom demonstrated that respect can be demanded without aggression. That quiet correction has remained one of the clearest examples of how he handles uncomfortable situations. He doesn't rely on anger to command respect. He earns it through composure, confidence, and the willingness to speak directly when something isn't right. And that brings us to the final moment on our countdown, the interview that best captures everything you've seen so far. If the previous 9 moments revealed Tom Cruise's ability to stay calm under pressure, this last one became the ultimate example of why so many interviewers learned the same lesson. Underestimating him is almost always a mistake. If there's one pattern you've probably noticed throughout this countdown, it's that Tom Cruise rarely reacts the way people expect him to. Interviewers push harder, questions become more personal, and the pressure keeps building. Yet somehow, he almost never gives the explosive response they're waiting for. That's exactly why this final moment deserves the #1 spot. It wasn't necessarily the most controversial question he'd ever been asked. It wasn't the longest interview or the loudest confrontation. What made it unforgettable was that it perfectly captured the quality that has defined Tom Cruise throughout his career. His ability to stay completely in control, even when someone else is trying to take that control away. By this point, Tom had spent decades speaking to reporters from every corner of the world. He had promoted countless films, attended thousands of interviews, and answered the same questions over and over again. Experience had taught him something invaluable. Not every question deserves an emotional response. Some are genuine, some are curious, and some are designed with only one purpose: to create a headline. Whenever those moments appeared, Tom rarely rushed to answer. Instead, he listened carefully, considered the wording, and responded with precision. If a question was fair, he gave it the attention it deserved. If it crossed a line, he calmly established a boundary. And if it was built on a false assumption, he challenged the assumption instead of accepting it. That's what separates this moment from so many other celebrity interviews. There was no shouting match, no dramatic walkout, no viral outburst that dominated the news for days. Instead, there was something far more difficult to achieve: complete emotional control. While the interviewer searched for a reaction, Tom refused to give one. He didn't allow frustration to dictate his words. He didn't let the conversation become a contest of egos. Every response was measured, every sentence intentional, and every pause served a purpose. The result was impossible to ignore. The interview gradually stopped feeling like an interrogation and started feeling like a lesson in communication. The pressure quietly shifted. Instead of questioning Tom's confidence, viewers found themselves questioning the approach being used against him. That's the hidden strength behind so many of Tom Cruise's most memorable interviews. He understands that losing your temper often means losing control. Once emotions take over, the conversation is no longer yours to lead. By staying calm, he keeps control where it belongs, with himself. It's a skill that extends far beyond celebrity interviews. Whether you're facing criticism at work, dealing with an unfair accusation, or responding to someone who's trying to provoke you, the same principle applies. Confidence isn't always about speaking louder than everyone else. Sometimes it's about refusing to let someone else decide how you're going to react. Tom Cruise has spent years demonstrating that lesson in front of millions of people. Not because he always has the perfect answer. Not because everyone agrees with everything he says. But because he consistently refuses to surrender his composure. That's what makes these moments so fascinating to watch. They aren't just stories about a famous actor handling difficult interviews. They're reminders that patience, preparation, and self-control can be far more powerful than anger or quick comebacks. So the next time you see Tom Cruise smiling during an interview, remember what you've seen today. That smile isn't a sign that he's easy to challenge. It isn't an invitation to push a little harder. And it certainly isn't a sign that he's about to lose his cool. It's the quiet confidence of someone who understands that real strength doesn't need to announce itself. Because when an interviewer tries to corner Tom Cruise, he doesn't shout. He doesn't argue. He doesn't chase the last word. He simply stays composed and lets that composure speak louder than anything else ever could. We've reached the end of our countdown, but if there's one lesson that connects every single moment we've covered, it's this. Real confidence doesn't always look dramatic. Throughout his career, Tom Cruise has been placed in countless uncomfortable situations. He's faced deeply personal questions, controversial topics, unfair comparisons, awkward hypotheticals, and even outright disrespect. In many of those moments, people expected him to react emotionally. They expected anger, frustration, or a headline-making outburst. Instead, they got something very different. Again and again, Tom demonstrated that staying calm can be far more powerful than raising your voice. Rather than allowing someone else to control the conversation, he consistently brought it back to respect, professionalism, and clear communication. Sometimes he answered directly. Sometimes he challenged the question itself. And sometimes he simply refused to engage with a conversation that wasn't worth having. That consistency is what makes these interviews so memorable. Whether you agree with every opinion he's ever expressed is a separate discussion. What stands out across these moments is the way he handles pressure. He rarely lets emotions dictate his responses. He listens before he speaks. He chooses his words carefully. And he understands that maintaining your composure often says more than any heated argument ever could. In an age where viral clips are often built around conflict and outrage, that's a surprisingly rare quality. Many public figures feel pressured to respond instantly or match the energy of whoever is challenging them. Tom has repeatedly shown a different approach. He doesn't try to dominate the room through volume. He earns attention through discipline and self-control. Perhaps that's why so many of these interviews continue to be shared years later. They're not remembered because of explosive arguments or shocking confrontations. They're remembered because they reveal how powerful calm confidence can be when the pressure is at its highest. And maybe that's the biggest takeaway from all of this. You don't have to win every argument. You don't have to answer every question. You don't have to prove yourself to everyone who challenges you. Sometimes the strongest response is setting a boundary with respect. Sometimes it's refusing to be pulled into someone else's agenda. And sometimes it's staying so composed that your actions speak louder than any comeback ever could. Tom Cruise has built an extraordinary career through talent, dedication, and relentless hard work. But these interviews reveal another side of him, one that isn't measured by box office numbers or blockbuster films. They show a person who understands the value of preparation, emotional control, and professionalism, even when conversations become uncomfortable. So what do you think? Which of these moments impressed you the most? And is there another Tom Cruise interview you think deserved a place on this list? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you enjoyed this countdown and want more stories about unforgettable celebrity interviews, iconic Hollywood moments, and the personalities behind the headlines, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Until next time, remember this. The loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes the person with the greatest control is the one who never has to raise their voice.